questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rubin. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Green, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the Obama administration's willingness to provide Iran with $400 million in cash on the same day Iran released all but one of the American hostages it held. In subsequent days, the United States delivered an additional $1.3 billion. At issue is whether the payment was proper, whether it was ransom, how Iran used the money, and whether the fact that the payment was made in cash might fuel greater terrorism. I've gone into detail in my written testimony, utilizing Iranian sources and Iranian government journals with regard to how Iranian figures perceive the payment, how they might launder it, what their strategy is, and how the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps corrupts the Iranian economy. For the sake of brevity, let me summarize. When Secretary of State John Kerry says the $1.7 billion was Iranian money, there's no reason it needed to be paid now. After all, successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, had delayed repayment so as to avoid funding Iranian terrorism. Likewise, if the United States freezes accounts linked to al-Qaeda or Hamas, releasing it and saying it's their money anyway would not be a tenable explanation. Cash payments are highly irregular. The closest precedent was the 1848 treaty ending the Mexican-American War. There is no critical economic need in Iran for which they have used the cash. The White House and State Department might perform intellectual somersaults to avoid calling the payment a ransom, but despite initial denials, the State Department has now acknowledged the linkage between the cash paid and the release of the hostages. We have had repeated diplomatic dialogue over the years, so to say that this is just a confluence of events is absolute nonsense. And Undersecretary of State William Burns, for example, met directly with the Iranians in 2006, I believe it was, Ryan Crocker in 2007, the whole Arms for Hostages scheme during the Reagan administration, that was at its core about diplomatic dialogue. Regardless, Washington's spin is irrelevant. Iranians perceived the payment to be a ransom and said so. Taking this money back was in return for the release of American spies, a senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps general said. Not only has delivery of the millions of dollars been perceived as a ransom, provided an incentive to seize more hostages, and indeed they have been seized, but because the money was delivered in cash, the payment bolstered the strength of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and augmented its ability to finance and conduct terrorism. I should say that reliance on the Iranian defense budget or their line items, it shouldn't be done. They're fictional. Iran's budget is opaque. After the Flatow verdict back in 1999 or 2000, where the judge assigned damages based on the line item for resistance, the line item simply disappeared in subsequent budgets. That didn't mean that the Iranians stopped conducting terrorism. Every time the United States government has offered Iran incentives in the face of terrorism, the Iranian response has been more terrorism and hostage-taking. That was the case with the Reagan-era Arms for Hostages scheme. It should be no surprise that the Iranians have seized more than a half dozen Western hostages in the months since. The problem isn't just incentivizing bad behavior. Rather, the problem is that the IRGC continues to dominate the Iranian economy. Allowing the IRGC to have custody of the money is to allow the group to launder cash for its own purposes. Even Iran's justice minister, just a month ago, has said that 50 million bank accounts in Iran are opaque or their ownership unclear. That's a country of 80 million people. 50 million bank accounts, the justice minister in Iran says, are basically bogus. In my written testimony, I also highlight how the IRGC often uses the Tehran Stock Exchange to launder money and play a shell game with companies to evade proliferation and terrorism sanctions. So this is another danger of making the payment in cash. Payment in cash is especially problematic as it hampers the ability of the intelligence community and the Treasury Department to trace it. Remember, the Iranian plot to murder the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. was exposed because the United States was monitoring specific bank accounts. Also remember that a suicide bomb belt can cost as little as $1,500. This hearing may be about Iran, but the issue is broader. What happens in Tehran doesn't stay in Tehran. Exposing U.S. rhetoric about refusal to pay ransom as empty has put a target on every American's back and convinced terrorist leaders and rogue regimes that kidnapping and ransoming pays. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Lorber. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Duffy, Vice Chairman Fitzpatrick, Ranking Member Green, and distinguished members of the committee, I am honored to appear before you today to discuss the dangers of ransom payments to Iran. In particular, I would like to focus my testimony on the legality of the $400 million cash payment, as well as the subsequent $1.3 billion cash payments, the risks that such payments pose, and how, most importantly, we could have structured these payments to limit Iran's ability to use these funds to support terrorism, weapons proliferation, and regional instability. With the recent one-year anniversary of the JCPOA, it is as important as ever to ensure that Iran is limited in its ability to support terrorist forces and corrupt the international financial system. Make no mistake, though Iran has signed and implemented the JCPOA, it has not changed the underlying criminal activity that has led respectable financial institutions across the world to refuse to do business there. Iran's unwillingness to change its destabilizing conduct is one of the reasons the payment of the $1.7 billion to the Islamic Republic raises serious concerns that this money will be, or already has been, used to support the IRGC, the Iranian military, and Iran's proxy terrorist forces throughout the region. To be clear up front, and as discussed, this payment does appear permitted under U.S. law. Pursuant to 31 CFR 560.510D2, which is part of the ITSR, U.S. persons are authorized to conduct all transactions necessary to payments related to settlement agreements in a legal proceeding between the United States and Iran. The provision permits U.S. government officials and foreign financial institutions to transfer these funds to Iran after a settlement agreement at the United States Iran Claims Tribunal, even if such transfers are done in cash. Though I will point out that, as Representative Royce noted, that means you could use the formal financial system to transfer these payments. You do not have to go through cash. Despite the likely legality of the transfer, however, the payment of this money to Iran, particularly without preconditions to ensure that it was not used to support Iran's terrorism-related activities, is both troubling and a missed opportunity. It is troubling because, in providing funds to Iran without controls on how it would use that money, we allowed the country to disperse these funds to the Iranian military and other nefarious actors. In addition, the very nature of the payment reportedly led IRGC officials to conclude that it amounted to a ransom. While the payment itself may not have been a prohibited ransom payment under U.S. law, Iran's perception of that payment matters. A principal purpose of the United States' no ransom policy is to deter hostage takers from compromising the safety of American citizens abroad. If terrorist groups and rogue countries do not think the U.S. will pay for hostages, those bad actors will be less likely to take them. Because of the particular nature of these payments, Iran believed this to be a ransom and consequently may be more inclined to seize Americans in the future, as Mr. Rubin noted. It is a missed opportunity because the United States could have set up payments stemming from the settlement agreement, providing the funds on ensuring they would not be able to support terrorism or be given to the Iranian military or sanctioned parties. By releasing these funds in such a way, rather than in unrestricted cash, the administration could have outmaneuvered the Islamic Republic. Moving forward, Congress should take specific steps to ensure that any funds given to Iran are subject to certain conditions. First, Congress could pass legislation that modifies 31 CFR 560.510 and requires that any funds to be sent to Iran pursuant to a settlement agreement be placed in an escrow account and released only upon meeting certain conditions, including that the funds not be provided to a sanctioned party and must be released in tranches with a certification provided by the Secretary of the Treasury and relevant U.S. government agencies that the prior released amount has not gone to designated parties or to entities engaged in a number of proscribed activities. Second, Congress could take steps, including passing legislation, to ensure that any payments made to Iran would present reduced risks of diversion by setting up a so-called whitelist, where Western banks could process legally permissible transactions to vetted and monitored Iranian banks with no connections to the IRC or to the government of Iran. Such a whitelist would create a specified channel for processing transactions, including settlement agreements like this one, in a way that would limit Iran's ability to channel the funds to the IRGC and designated parties. As Iran continues to support terrorism and foment regional instability, the United States should ensure that we play no role in inadvertently funding such activities or putting U.S. citizens at risk. These proposals, I believe, are a step in that direction. I look forward to discussing them with you during the remainder of the hearing. Thank you for your time.